Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever tried to really follow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you hit this wall pretty quickly. It feels less like a disagreement and more like two different realities clashing.
That's a great way to put it. And that's because fundamentally, it is about two different realities. Uh, Deeply coherent, internally consistent realities, but they just can't coexist.
Right. So today we're going beyond the usual news cycle stuff. We want to look at the architecture of these narratives based on the source material we've reviewed. Like, what are the underlying beams holding these worldviews up?
Exactly. We're talking about the trust anchors, those core beliefs that everything else rests on, the things that are vaguely unquestioned within each group.
And the key insight, maybe the most important takeaway from the analysis, is that this whole thing is, at its heart, an epistemic crisis.
Hmm. Sounds academic, but it just means the fight isn't really about the facts themselves.
It's about the rules. Who decides what counts as proof? Whose history matters? What moral code are we even using? That's the real battleground.
And once you grasp that, you understand why some arguments just bounce off, why certain information is accepted without question and other stuff is dismissed out of hand. It depends on the underlying moral wiring.
Okay, so let's get into the first one. The Israeli belief system. The analysis calls it a binding system. What does that mean, binding?
Yeah, binding comes from moral foundations theory. It refers to moral intuitions that emphasize group cohesion, loyalty, authority, sanctity, things that bind groups together.
And the Israeli narrative, according to the source, uses all of these binding foundations.
Simultaneously. And the individualizing ones too, care, fairness. It creates this moral thickness, as the source puts it. It's like a fortress, incredibly reinforced from multiple angles.
So let's break that down. The binding anchors first, the group stuff. Loyalty seems huge.
Absolutely central. The idea of Am Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. All Jews are responsible for one another. That's a core operating principle. Yeah, it means information, actions, everything gets filtered through. Does this help the group? Does it ensure survival?
And that ties into authority, respect for institutions, tradition.
Yes, deep respect. For historical tradition, the Torah, the Talmud, but also for modern institutions, the Knesset, the IDF. They're seen as legitimate inheritors of Jewish self-governance across time.
And then there's purity, or sanctity. That's about the land, right? Eretz Israel.
The land itself becomes sacred, indivisible.
Yeah.
So the act of return, Aliyah, isn't just moving house. It's framed as spiritual purification and compromise on land. That doesn't feel like politics. It feels like desecration.
Okay, so those are the group binding pillars, but you said it uses the individualizing ones too, like care and fairness.
It does, and these are often used to explain the narrative externally. Care harm is almost entirely defined by never again.
The Holocaust.
Primarily, yes. But it links all contemporary threats back to that existential vulnerability. So an event like October 7th isn't just a terrible attack.
It's framed as the largest massacre since the Holocaust.
Exactly. It validates the never again imperative on an existential level. It makes the threat feel permanent, always lurking.
And fairness.
That's about proportionality. The argument that after millennia of persecution, of survival, Jews deserve a state. It's a claim based on historical justice and persistence.
So this thick moral structure supports the main claims of the narrative. What are those core claims?
Okay, there are basically four pillars holding up the main structure. First, historical and religious indigeneity.
This is where they cite the Bible, archaeology.
Right, the Hebrew Bible as the foundational text. Archaeological findings like the Merneptah stele, inscriptions, evidence of continuous presence in places like Jerusalem, Hebron. It's about establishing ancient roots and authority.
Claim 2 flows from that, existential necessity.
A sovereign state isn't a choice. It's the only way to guarantee survival. That's the core belief, reinforced constantly by events interpreted through that never-again lens.
Third.
Legal and international legitimacy. This is crucial. They point to the Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Conference, the UN Partition Plan.
As international validation of their right to establish the state.
Correct. A just legal process recognized by the world is how it's framed.
And the fourth claim directly addresses the Palestinian narrative.
Yes, it has to. It frames the Palestinian right of return as fundamentally unacceptable, not as a claim for justice, but as an existential demographic threat.
A war of return.
That's the term sometimes used internally, yeah. The idea is that it aims to dismantle the Jewish character of the state, ending Jewish self-determination. So it's a non-starter, these four claims, wrapped in that thick moral blanket. It's very resilient.
You can see the internal logic. It holds together tightly. Okay, let's shift gears. The Palestinian belief lattice. If the Israeli one is binding and thick, how does the Palestinian system work? What's its core?
It's different. The source describes it as primarily a justice system. It's built much more strongly on those individualizing foundations: liberty, fairness, and care. Think less about group binding, more about rights, justice, and anti-colonial struggle.
And the absolute center of that is liberty versus oppression.
Unquestionably. That's the main engine. The entire conflict is framed as a national liberation struggle against occupation, against what they define as a system of oppression, which is Zionism in their view.
So resistance becomes...
A necessary response, a moral and political imperative flowing directly from that frame of being oppressed and seeking liberty.
Okay, and that connects to the fairness principle.
Which here is about fairness as equity. It's focused on achieving justice and, crucially, redress for historical wrongs.
And the ultimate expression of that is the right of return.
Yes. The return of refugees displaced in 1948 and their descendants is seen as the absolute minimum required for justice. It's non-negotiable because anything less fails to redress the original wrong.
And the emotional fuel for this is the Care Harm Foundation, centered on the Nakba.
Nakba, the catastrophe. And it's vital to understand how it's framed. It's not just a historical event in 1948.
It's seen as ongoing.
Exactly. Every demolition, every restriction, every new settlement is viewed as a continuation of that original displacement. It keeps the trauma alive, present, constantly fueling the sense of injustice and the need for resistance.
So this justice-focused architecture supports its own set of core claims. Let's walk through those.
Okay, 5 main ones here. First, like the Israeli narrative, is indigeneity and historical continuity. But the evidence is different.
How so?
Instead of ancient texts and archaeology primarily, it emphasizes demographic records showing Palestinians as the overwhelming majority, like 92–93% when the Balfour Declaration happened. It relies more on social histories, family memories, oral traditions to establish deep roots.
Claim 2 is the framing we mentioned, settler colonialism.
Right. Zionism is explicitly defined as a settler colonial project. They often reference scholars like Patrick Wolfe, arguing its inherent logic requires the elimination of the native for the project to succeed.
Which leads directly to the third claim about the Nakba itself.
That the displacement of 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians wasn't just a tragic consequence of war, but a systematic, intentional process of ethnic cleansing. They point to evidence like Zionist military plans, Plan Dalet, for example.
Okay. And the fourth claim attacks the external validation the Israeli narrative relies on.
Exactly. It rejects the Balfour Declaration and the UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, as illegitimate, imposed from the outside, violating the right to self-determination of the people actually living there, the majority.
And all this culminates in Claim 5.
The right of return, which they ground in international law, specifically UN Resolution 194, and the linked right of resistance, justified under principles of anti-colonialism. It's a very clear sequence. We were here. Colonialism displaced us unjustly, the ongoing Nakba, so we have the right to return and the right to resist until we can.
Wow. Okay, so 2 incredibly robust systems. Internally consistent, morally charged, but built on foundations that just cancel each other out.
That's the core of the intractability, yeah.
But here's where the analysis gets, I think, really fascinating. Despite the totally different content of these beliefs.
The way they defend themselves, the cognitive mechanisms they use, are identical.
Okay, what are they?
First one is called rational deauthorization. Basically, you discredit any source or authority that challenges your narrative by labeling it biased or hostile.
Examples.
Well, you see Israeli sources often dismissing the UN, pointing to the sheer number of resolutions against Israel as proof of inherent bias. Palestinians might dismiss critical analyses as being politically motivated, Zionist propaganda, or ignoring the context of occupation. You find a reason to reject the messenger.
Makes sense. Protects the core beliefs. What's the second mechanism?
Validated threat assessment. This uses the availability heuristic, relying on memories that are easily recalled, usually because they're emotionally charged.
So you assess current threats based on the most vivid, scary memories from the past.
Exactly. But crucially, it's seen as validated. It's not an overreaction. It's learning from history. For Israelis, October 7th immediately brings the Holocaust to mind. See, it can happen again. For Palestinians, every new settlement isn't just policy. It's proof the Nakba never ended. The most extreme historical precedent feels immediately relevant.
Okay, those make sense. But you said there's an ultimate shield, the one that's absolutely necessary.
Yes. This is the linchpin, according to the source, the foundational asymmetry. You might know it as the ultimate attribution error in psychology.
Explain that. How does it work?
Okay, think about everyday life. If you make a mistake, say you snap at someone, you tend to blame the situation. I was stressed, I hadn't slept. It's situational.
Right, external factors.
But if someone else snaps at you, you're more likely to think, wow, they're just a rude person. You attribute it to their inherent character, their disposition.
Okay, I see the difference. So how does that apply here?
It's applied consistently along in-group, out-group lines. When the in-group takes action, it's always explained as situational.
So Israeli actions like settlement expansion.
Explained internally as driven by security needs, by the external threat, or as a justified expression of their historical claims, a necessary response to the situation.
And Palestinian actions like resistance.
Framed within their narrative as the necessary, unavoidable response to the situation of occupation and oppression, forced upon them by external circumstances.
When the outgroup acts.
It's attributed to their inherent nature, their disposition, a fundamental flaw in their character or ideology.
So hostile Palestinian actions are seen by Israelis as stemming from
An inherent persistent rejectionism, maybe linked to religious extremism or an ideology that simply refuses peace. It's who they are.
And conversely, how is Zionism often framed in the Palestinian narrative?
In essentialist terms, as an intrinsically flawed ideology, a settler colonial project driven by an internal, unchanging desire for exclusion and dominance. It's not about security needs, it's about the fundamental nature of Zionism itself.
And the source says this isn't just accidental bias, it's structurally required.
It has to be this way for the narratives to survive intact. Think about it. If the Israeli narrative accepted Palestinian resistance as a perhaps understandable situational response to occupation,
It would completely undermine their claims about legality, necessity, and the inherent nature of the threat.
exactly. And if the Palestinian narrative accepted Israeli security actions as potentially genuine situational responses to perceived threats, rather than purely ideological expansionism.
It would undermine the core settler colonial framing and the narrative of inherent oppression.
Right. Each side needs to see the other's negative actions as flowing from an unchanging negative disposition. It preserves their own moral clarity and the coherence of their entire reality.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what does it mean for you listening to this? We've looked at two belief systems, both incredibly strong, internally logical.
But built on premises, on trust anchors that are fundamentally incompatible, mutually exclusive.
Which is why just arguing about facts or history or even international law often goes nowhere. You're not operating in the same reality. You don't even agree on the rules of evidence or the moral framework.
Understanding this architecture, these cognitive shields and moral foundations is so important. It helps explain why the conflict is so intractable, why diplomacy is so hard. You're not just asking people to compromise on land, you're asking them to potentially dismantle the very psychological structure that gives their group meaning and tells them they're in the right.
Which leads to a pretty challenging final thought from the source material. If this cognitive asymmetry, this need to see your own side as situational and the other side as dispositionally flawed, is actually a functional and necessary part of maintaining group identity and moral clarity.
And you see this pattern not just here, but in many entrenched conflicts like Ukraine and Russia.
Then how can any group achieve real, lasting peace? Does it require them to fundamentally break down the psychological framework that defines who they are and assures them of their own righteousness?
That's the really tough question, isn't it? It's something to definitely mull over.